one. Hello, everyone. Another session with the Digital Life Collective. This is Joachim Stroh from Brooklyn, New York. I'm not sure if I'm hosting today. I'm certainly recording it.
You are host.
And then I'm hosting it. Okay. So today's agenda is number 1, GDPR, number 2, GDPR, and number 3, GDPR. Unless there's something else. Steve, did we add anything else?
No, I think that's GDPR. It is.
Okay. I think Philip is going to join us. He said something in about half an hour or so.
He hopes.
He hopes, yeah. In the meantime, we're recording this, so anybody can review it. Jim?
Christina brought up open spaces, but somehow we let her get away without adding that to the agenda. I think that is an activity that if Ben will host, or if we get a alternate host, that we should be running these open spaces, and that would be good.
Okay, Jim, I put that. I did actually make a note on that, and I put in the possibility of an open space and needing to check with Ben. I think Christina did say about checking with Ben before she left. Is that correct? Did Christina say that, or did you, Jim?
Yeah, but beyond that, I'm thinking about what kind of open spaces we need to get together, panelists or people interested in. And GDPR is one of those areas. And I've been talking with the IIW folks about the GDPR cookie, which is a strange thing, which nobody really knows what it is, I think, and I'm trying to tease that out of them. But the implication, I think, is that we can come up with standard. I mean, I've seen this magic happen in IIW, where boom, we have a standard, and all of a sudden we have a way where we can discover the policies that the vendor has to adhere to from the visitor, and cache that, and it can be revoked, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm thinking that while we're doing Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 of the GDPR, that we may actually be able to do some Horizon 3, in that there is no standard. We can make the standard, and be the first compliant organization.
Wow, you're the optimist, Jim.
No.
Surprise. All right. So let me maybe take a step back here and share with you what I have learned so far the last couple of days, actually, looking into some documents, starting with one that Konobi posted in one of our channels. Maybe I'll start sharing the screen, talk about that document, and then lead into a discussion of how we can respond to that, right? So what are the options that we have? How feasible are these options? And then how do we move forward from here? That's kind of my approach. Does it sound good? Yep.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So let me share my screen. Hop back onto, it's in the Tech We Trust channel on Mattermost. and it started right here. This post called "How Will the GDPR Impact Open Source Communities?" So that article, certainly broadened the whole scope of this. Because before that, I wasn't sure how much are we going to be impacted, as a collective, as a community, as a, cooperative. We are actually incorporated in the UK, so keep that in mind. And the UK has not left the European Union yet, right? They're going to leave, I think, next year sometime. So we have to be under full compliance here. So keep that in mind. So this document is interesting because it's in very plain language lists what needs to happen for, in this case, open source communities. So kind of the weakest part, kind of organization that's out there, and they fully, fall under these the GDPR, the new laws. So if they are, then obviously a looser network like the collective, like us, will fall under that same direction. Okay, but what is nice about this document, it breaks it down into certain pieces, and that's important to me to understand what happens to us. And then under, so here GDPR changes and its impact. Let me quickly list some of these things. The obvious one is consent, right? So this is just saying if you do anything on the website, you have to consent that we're going to use your data for certain purposes. So we have to make it very clear what the data is we're using and how we're going to use it, right? And you have to agree to that. That's the first step. And that's for users. If you're in the UK, then obviously everyone. If you're in the US, then it's for any European user that's coming to your website. So they have to give consent before anything else can happen, right? So that's kind of the easy one. That's kind of the one that says, okay, let's wait for vendors or the owners of websites and these environments just come up with ways to pull up this agreement thing, that form. The stuff that actually Facebook is putting together now. They're having they're rolling up this whole thing with you have to consent to using their services now, especially because obviously they're in the advertising business. So there's a lot they have to show to the user, and the user has to consent to that. I think they're going even as far as saying, if you don't consent, you can't use our service. Certainly that's true, I think, for the advertising model. If you don't agree with that, then you can no longer do business with them. But we're not Facebook. That's good news. But we do have tools, and we do need this consenting thing up and running on our sites. But let me get to that in a moment. What I think that means. So here's where it gets more interesting. Here's the right to access, right? So any European citizen can ask what is going on with my data. Right? How do you process my data? There's the right to be forgotten, right? So if I don't want my name anymore associated with the collective, take it out wherever it is. Erase all of my data, please. There's breach notification. So if anything happens in the collective, we need to report that and say what happened within 72 hours and say who was affected and so on, right? So that's number 3, and number 4 is this registration thing. So any of the procedures, policies, tools that we're going to use with respect to the requirements of the GDPR have to be written down. I don't know if it's published, but certainly we have to document everything. So if somebody requests documentation about this, we have it. It's here. This is how we would roll this stuff out, right? So that's 4 sort of more process and tool related steps, right? The right to access, the right to be forgotten, the breach notification, and this register thing. So documentation, really, internal documentation. And why do you do this? Well, simply because you don't want to get fined for that, right? So the current fine is set at 20 million or I think 4% of annual turnover here, right? Whatever is greater, not smaller, it's greater. So 20 million we're looking at this year. I'm not sure what the legal implication is for a cooperative, but if we get hit with any fine, and if we're unable to pay for that, I don't know how that works out. But that may be a question for our legal team, right? And I don't want to get into that discussion today, because I want to look into what would that mean for us, right? So that's the document, right? So it's posted in the Tech We Trust channel. You can look it up and read it. And what I did is then I looked into, yeah, okay, questions. Yeah, that's right. I should pause.
Points out rising, particularly from the Europeans amongst us.
Yeah. Let me stop here.
Does this sort of fit with your picture of GDPR on the horizon, Steve?
Well, so I was just checking the document that John did about GDPR, just to see who's actually been in and read and sort of done other things on that. I think what Joachim says is a reasonable summary. I must say the question you raised about the processes and the process documentation, I'm not entirely clear on whether that needs to be open or not. I don't know if John knows. John may know. Do you know, John, about the documentation? You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Now we hear.
It's only as part of the process. It doesn't have to be public. So if you are looked into under GDPR, they would expect you to have everything documented. I don't think it's as big an issue as it seems to be. It may be down. I think it would be useful to have Philip here. But a belt and braces approach would be to write to everybody that is already a member, asking them to formally opt in to all the services that we provide now and in the future, and repeat that for each anniversary of the subscription. So it's not coverage of Mattermost and any other services they've got. It's the whole is the collective. And all the services that we use, Google, and what we know what the list is, as far as a member's concerned, it's about opting into those platform services. Where there is an issue is that needs to be looked at, and actually nobody has a clue yet what to do. I'm a bit uncomfortable by this being recorded, so I'll just have to talk in tongues. But people are kind of sucking and seeing or waiting and seeing, because there's quite a few contradictions in the GDPR. For example, if you're asked to remove a person, or a person makes a request to be forgotten, that's the loosest term, you do have to audit that. So when you have an audit trail of a person that's been asked to remove, well, you've still got personal identification information within your systems. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a recursive loop. Right. It doesn't stop. When you visit a website that uses cookies, both session cookies I think are okay, but permanent cookies, that's when other weird issues appear, especially when you start to use third-party cookies, which most people do. And I'm just going to talk generally now, but all I can see at the moment is on the 25th of May, every website that you hit will just have an opt-in screen first. And you'll have to tick a box and then accept before you see anything. So you could argue that the EU is actually going to ruin the internet. But also, I see common sense prevailing, and that's not going to happen. So on the website, we need to look at that kind of thing, opting in. Although we don't have cookies, we still have to say those kind of things. And at some future point, they have to, when they've opted in, they also have to have the ability to opt out at any time that they choose and destroy all the information. So that's
one point, John, you said a blanket opt-in relating to past services, but you also said blanket opt-in for future services?
Well, that's what's just come to mind during this conversation, because we could be looked at as employees as well. You know, if you look at a company, so you'd look at what an employment contract would look like, and you could say as part of that, we have to store information about you. We have to store it in case of an emergency, in order for you to be able to actually do your job. And in that, in the collective, that includes Mattermost. Now, Mattermost is open source. There's other versions which purport to be GDPR compliant. But to have an overall contract with a member that's GDP compliant, and it is automatically renewed as part of your membership fee. So you have a thing where that's the thing about GDPR is you have to opt in rather than it being automatic. So forms that have pre-ticked boxes are illegal. Websites that say, by carry on using this website, they are illegal. I mean, people can read. People aren't stupid. So I think I don't know if I'm reluctant what to say. You got to put my valve on, but that's one thing. But I think Steve may have extra anecdotal evidence at the moment that we are approaching the month. The 25th will be a month to go, and I still think people are trying to work out the idiosyncrasies of the regulation, and it is big. I know whether everybody the European Union is the biggest economy in the world at the moment, and the Americans have to comply. The Americans will probably get an advantage where they don't have to follow these things, so their big tech companies may take a lead. I've just recently read a document about. I can share it if you like, but you have to be subscribed to this news agency. But I'm going off on a tangent there. But there's a lot of grey areas.
Yeah, well, we know that nobody is going to make the deadline. Okay, we know there's some leeway there, and
I think companies that 20 million euro fine, that will make companies act. What they will do is as long as it's written down and they've used the common sense, that's as far as they can go. Where the law's unclear, well, yeah, you can't do that. But to just turn around and say, "Oh, we're not going to do it because we don't like it," well, that's not going to work.
Right. That's great, John. Thank you for this perspective. Very, very helpful. I want to drill down on a couple of things. Jim, yeah.
Yeah, yes, I am optimistic, but the VRM effort solves the problem to a great extent, in that if my policy is obeyed by the vendor, I can use the service. Okay, and it's just an issue of defining that policy in UMA and SAML, and how we define policy, the ways that we define these policies. I think it's very doable that we can, provide a means for members to policy to be discovered by the collective and matched against the policy of the collective. Now,
right.
This is obviously something that will start out simple and become more complex as the rules are accounted for.
So, right, Jim, let's see. This thing comes up in a month, right? So let's see what we can do today, actually, here in the collective, what we should do to become compliant, right? That's the goal here. Let's take a look at that. And John, since you brought up some of these vendor-related things, let me share my screen here again, because what I also did is, I looked at some vendors, software vendors, and see what they do. They actually, as you suggested, John, they're working very hard to become compliant, right? So here is an example of Slack, right? Doing the GDPR compliance. So of course they have the funds, they have the money, they have the will to create the tools. So you can see there's a whole bunch of tools that they're going to provide to their users, right? To import, export data, to look at what's stored, to delete the data, right? To anonymize, I don't know however they want to do it, right? So of course, I think they are ready to go, ready to roll, right? And then same Mattermost, if you look at that vendor, they have a tool for compliance, right? So they've written a whole bunch of things to see how can they make their users compliant. This leads to one of the issues I wanted to bring up today is these kind of compliance tools, they cost money, okay? They're not free. In case of Mattermost, that would mean an enterprise E20 license, as they call it, right? And that's a custom pricing issue, and that's way beyond what we can do here to sort of have the right tools in place to comply with this directive, right? And one more thing, John, you mentioned, blanket statements. I don't think that's the case. If you read the article, it says specifically it has to be per service or per tool. Each one has to be consented to. So if you have Discourse, if you have Mattermost, if you have Slack, let's say, these 3 tools, and the website, of course, well, then you need to get consent into each 3 of them. So bind to this.
That's the responsibility of the service provider.
Yeah, I mean, they provide, of course, they give you the tools to do that, right? So you go to Slack, and then they have the whole tool sets available to you, right? So you go into Slack, you'll be prompted from then on, if you're from that region to consent, right? And then you move on. And then you get into the tool or service that you're using, right? But it's per tool we're talking about, or per service. We can't do something that I thought originally is possible, something like the cookie directive, right? We have that already on the website, and it pops up, you say, okay, you're done with it, right? Out of the way. This isn't as easy as this cookie directive thing, right? You can't just pop up, that says it also in the article, it can just pop up with an agreement, you click through, and then you're done with everything you do on the website. It's not. Okay, so that's a couple of tools here. That was about the Facebook, right? So let's talk about what we need to do here. So I put together, let me stop sharing here. Here's my three-step plan that we need to do. Can you see that? I'll talk about it. I'll talk 3 steps. So it's easy. It's 3 C's we have to follow. C number 1 is collecting the data. That means make a list of all the data points we're collecting about our users. Easy one, right? So Philip started this already, I believe, to say we're collecting data in MailTrain, we're collecting data in Stripe, we're collecting data in Mattermost, we're collecting data on the website, blah, blah, blah. List the data points, all data points that we have that are related to people using the services, right? That's number 1. The second C is the consent thing. So that's, John talked about that, is where we have to come up with this screen, prompt, agreement, email, whatever it is, to say, yes, this is going to happen. I understand that fully. I want to continue using your services. Yes or no, and I'm leaving you. Okay, so that's the consent thing. And again, this is per technology piece we're using, not a blanket statement for everything that you're going to buy into. So number 2, the consent, I think that's easy too. I think we'll be able to do that. And as John said, probably the vendors will help you doing that. So if you're using Mattermost, there'll be an additional screen and agreement somewhere we can invoke through an admin function, and then people just click through this, read, and if not, they can't use the tool. End of story. Fairly simple. But here's the difficult one, the third one. The third C is comply. So to fully comply, remember that document I showed you earlier, we need to comply with these procedures, right? With the thing right to be forgotten, right to access and the register and the other thing. Comply. So that breaks down into two pieces. One is on the technology side, to make sure we can erase the data, we can show reports, you can export the data, for each tool that we're using, right? So that's on the technology side. And on the other side is, of course, the process. So we need a dedicated role for that, a person who is there, who runs these things, right? Who knows how to access the data, who knows how to get to the tool, who has access to the tool, and can run the reports, right? Or make sure we are in compliance, right? Write down the procedures, updates that stuff, and has knowledge about this. So technology and process. So two things in order to fully comply with what this thing demands, right? And then I looked into, on the technology side, that means different licenses, right? So I mentioned the E20 license for Mattermost, for example, in case we're continuing to use Mattermost, right? So we need a different licensing model. That means it's a per user license. Then we get access to the tools that will support the GDPR compliance, right? We can't do this on our own. We have to rely on the vendor here. That's for me, that's one of the biggest kickers here. It's this reliance that this creates suddenly on the vendors. And then they have, of course, the power to say, whoa, our compliance license costs you X amount of dollars, right? Because you get all these extra services. Not everybody uses it, right? But if you want it, you can have it. Please pay for it, right? So that's a pretty big, it's not new, right? There were always these compliance licenses they come along with these tools. Like Mattermost has this today, right? For HIPAA compliance, for all kinds of data destruction compliances that they need in enterprise settings. So they exist, right? So it's nothing new here. It's just a lot broader here today, and that's one of the issues. Hey, Philip, we're in the midst of a GDPR conversation here. You missed third of it, I would say, but we do want your opinion on this, of course, and your point. But let me wrap up here. I'm just in the middle of putting together sort of a model what needs to happen in our collective. So that's the technology, that's the license issue we have to address, and then the other one is the process issue. So that needs a dedicated person and role, probably a paid role here, to say that person needs to be on standby, on ready to move in if anybody has a request. And if anything comes in, we need to be able to process that using the different tools. So that's the third area, and that's the most critical for us. And that's the thing I think at this point in time, we don't have the capacity or capability to address. Okay.
I don't think that's required until you're a certain size of organization, and we're not. So dedicated privacy officer is only required. I can't remember the size, but I knew it was substantially.
That's over 200 people, but Joachim's point is different. Joachim's point is that if we are challenged, we need to be able to respond. Right?
Right.
That's regardless of the size of the organization. So if someone wants to know what data we have about them, we need to be able to respond.
Oh, so if there's a request rather than a challenge, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
And at the moment, because we don't have a dedicated person, and if we did it randomly, things may drop through the cracks, and we may end up having people who put in a request and never get a response.
Right. So it's not, Philip, it's not an official role I'm talking about here. As you said, probably we're not required to do that. But it's a role, a dedicated role, a person who can handle this, who's updating the records, who knows what to do, who has access to the tools, and so forth, right? And that's the difficult part. And let me just step you quickly through the other two that I mentioned earlier. You haven't heard that, Philip. And those other two are actually doable for us. Number one, and I broke it down into the 3 C's here. My model is 1, 2, 3, make it easy, 3 C's. Number one is collect, right? What data are we collecting? Easy peasy, right? So we can go out into each of the tools, MailTrain, Mattermost, Discourse, website, what are we collecting? Listed out, here's full inventory of the stuff we're collecting. Fine, no problem with that. Second one is the consent piece, right? That's the piece where you have to have agreement, an explicit agreement by the user that he or she is okay using our tech for that kind of stuff, right? And explaining, in glory detail what it is that we're collecting and why we're collecting this stuff. And this goes beyond, unfortunately, it goes beyond just the simple cookie directive that we've done in the past, right? So quickly, some quick notes, and then say, okay, you're done with it, right? This is not the case. If you read that document I posted there, Kenobi actually posted, you need to be much more explicit of what it is and why you're doing that. And it has to happen per tool, per technology, okay? So if you have Slack, if you have Discourse, if you have MetaMost, if you have Stripe, each one needs to have your explicit consent that it's okay to use Stripe, it's okay to use MetaMost, it's okay to use Discourse, and it's okay to use the website, right? So that has to be separated. It's not a blanket statement anymore, which is actually not bad because the vendors will support that, obviously, right? There are a couple of examples I put out there, like Slack is heavy duty. Of course, they have enough resources to do that, and they provide the tools for their users, right? For their customers. So easy peasy, just click a button and then comes up with an agreement screen, and you can customize that screen. You click through. If you don't want that, then you're out, right? That's the condition here, because you can't use the service if you're not consenting here, right? That's an important piece. So that's doable too. So number one, collecting the data is doable. Number two, consenting all of the different services to is doable, I think. Number three, I am not so sure, right? The comply thing, the third C, which is we have to look at our technology, have to look at our licensing models, licenses we have, and we have to look at the process, who's doing what, and can we have a full-time position, almost full-time position for that dedicated person that's happened to take care of that. That's why my thinking is we will have a hard time being 100% compliant. Now, do we need to be, how realistic is that they actually audit us? And that's the other discussion we had yesterday. But one more thing, Philip, and then you can jump in. We are a collective that's sort of confrontational, okay? So we have members that get into heavy-duty arguments at times, right? Which is natural, which is okay, right? But I can see situations where members, will just leave, They disagree with our current statement on technology we trust or whatever, right? And just break out. And they might want to say, okay, let me test this thing with the collective, okay? See how far this can go. And then we are in a situation where, we have to go through this process. So we have to be ready to do that. We're not a lenient, space where, this thing will never happen. It is, I think, feasible to assume that we'll have members, and they have certain points of view, and we need to be cautious about that, right? So that's why I'm saying, put number one was in my 3 points there earlier. Put the stick in the head in the ground, right? And nothing will ever happen to us. It's certainly the default probably for most organizations, but it's risky too. We have to acknowledge that, right? That's my point of view on that. Anyway, so I'm handing it over to you guys, Philip.
I just actually was doing some GDPR stuff this week, and I found my first presentation on it that was 3.5 years old. And it's fair to say that it was difficult to get people to be alarmed about it or to be concerned. And now I find that people are moving through concern as the deadline is approaching and moving into a state of alarm. And I agree with you on the first two C's. I have a different perspective on the third C. I can't see that it's anywhere near as technically challenging as pulling a website together, which we've done. So we just have to know how we would go about it should someone make a request. It's their legal right to make a request. It's our legal responsibility to reply. Our tool sets are very simple, and we just have to know how to extract data from each of those and zip it up and send it out. It's a manual process because we won't be able to automate it. It's a bit of a pain in the ass, each request might take an hour or two, but I can't imagine we're going to have 120 requests just to test the system. I don't think our membership is like that.
Okay, let me respond to that, Philip, because there's one thing you're missing. Mattermost does not have the capability to be compliant right now the way we have. There's a certain open source license we have that is not compliant. If you want to be compliant, we are in a different space. That means,
in what way is it not compliant? We host it ourselves. So in what way is it not compliant?
You would need tools to, let's say, erase a user there. It's a special compliance tool that goes beyond just a manual erasure, right? Going there and deleting a member, right? You can do that, of course. But you need more tools that erase more data out of the database. And that's
I don't think there's anything that says it has to be an automated process. That you have a process is all they request. And the new architecture is very well suited to mapping the requests to the various backends that we have.
So Jim, we don't have access to the backend of Mattermost, okay? We don't.
Well, we have the API. The API is the backend, and we can,
that's still restricted and doesn't have compliance API calls.
That's true, but we can mutate.
Sorry, an API call to a database that we host.
Yeah.
Yes. So we just use a database tool.
No, we can't.
Oh. How come?
Because we don't. You need an interface to get to that data, right? Mattermost provides the interface. You can, of course, hack directly into the.
I do that a lot for WordPress. I often go and edit my WordPress directly in the SQL.
John, go ahead.
Just to I hope Philip can back me up on this, but just to look at it from a different perspective, because I think it's been overcomplicated here. The GDPR isn't designed to put businesses out of business. It's just there for consumer protection and protection for the public. Now, I had a discussion with SL2 team quite a while ago, probably more than 3 months ago. And in there I said, is it possible if somebody was to withdraw from a collective to have all their work taken with them? And I think it was Michael that said, well, no, because that has now become part of the commons. So what you've contributed to Mattermost in your discussions belongs to the collective. It's not personally identifiable information. That's what GDPR is trying to protect. So it would be as simple as if somebody leaves, or if somebody requests that I want the right to be forgotten in the collective, you just delete the user and you audit that. There is a delete user facility, and that's the end of the story.
Yes, I would back that up, John, in almost every respect, except for your use of the word public. Personal data is defined under GDPR as applying to all of our individual roles in life. So it's a surprise to some of the people I'm talking to with 5 weeks to go that it covers employees, for example, not just customers, which has for some reason escaped lots of people's attention. It's quite funny. But we don't have any employees. In fact, the only two types of people we have are members and non-members. And so some of our systems are only accessible by members, and some of our systems are accessible to members and non-members. But we've chosen deliberately to avoid any data collection that's not explicit. So nothing inferred. The only thing that we have that ranks as personal data in our system is that people have explicitly contributed. So it's actually the easiest of all the GDPR things I'm considering at the moment. This is by far and away the easiest case to grapple with. The only, in fact, if I was going to categorize the S end of small and medium enterprises, right now, I think most of them, vast majority of them, would not be GDPR compliant by the deadline. And they don't expect to be found out either. They'll probably do it in 2 or 3 years' time. That's not to say we should not be compliant. Given the nature of our mission, it's kind of important that we hit the deadline, and we should do so.
Okay, so back to John, right? If you're saying it's as easy as removing a user from the tool we're using, that'd be good. But then I don't understand why you have these compliance tools available. Like if you read the Slack website, what they do to actually become GDPR compliant, there's a whole set of tools that they make available to their customers, right? That's not the just simply taking out a user, because you can do that today in Slack. That's no issue. You don't have to use that stuff.
There's generally two things: either delete them, erase me, the right to be forgotten, as it's become known. The other one is I'd like a copy of everything. Now that's when a tool comes in handy, because at the moment there is no Mattermost tool to say export all of Steve Taylor's contributions and give it to him in some kind of file. We don't have that. That would be something that would require a query on the SQL.
Well, yeah, or if we have a person to do that and figure out how the query would look like, that's fine. Or the other way is the compliance license, right? That they provide, and then they provide that tool to do that.
Marvelous. I haven't got as far as looking at that. How much does that cost?
It's negotiable.
It's okay. It's out of budget. Let's say that.
Oh, is it really? Oh, marvelous. That's because they want to get the PricewaterhouseCoopers who use Mattermost to cough up, I'd imagine, rather than the 120-person cooperative based in the UK.
I think we should offer them a deal.
But Philip, GDPR doesn't allow individuals to request all the contributions they've made to a company, right?
If it's an attributed comment in a forum, that is under the broadest interpretation of personal data, that is personal data, because it's identified as coming from you.
If you remove the identification,
then you don't know who you're talking to.
That was the past, man. We're not talking to them anymore. They left, so we know that. We don't know who we're not talking to, so they're gone. The question is, does what they left as the trail in the record manage GDPR by removing the identification?
I mentioned this in Mattermost a while ago, and I think Laura and I had a brief discussion about this. But this law has been in force for 10 years. You can write to any company and demand for all the information that they've got, except it costs you a tenner. All the GDPR does is it's free, and you have to do it within, I think it's quite a short period, 14 days or something like that. So it's not radical, is it?
Well, it's radical in its implications. I mean, it's the British will remember that the first horseless carriages were required to have a man walking in front with a red flag to avoid them upsetting the horses. Do you remember that?
A bit too young.
Yeah, well, then the Americans may recall that at one stage people argued that airplanes should not fly over their heads because it was their property.
I was suggesting that the reason that nobody has a solution to GDPR and nobody will be compliant is that there is no VRM standard. Okay, that's the target of VRM to standardize that. And I think that a Horizon 3 thing that we should experiment with is policies and include UMA and SAML assertions. People are using SAML with UMA already for business rules. But initially, what it would be very trivial until the rules were developed. But the formal rules would allow you to get agreement without bothering the user in many cases, and identify where the agreement needed to be reaffirmed or permission needed to be granted. Now these GDPR cookies they're talking about, and I don't know if it should be a cookie, or whatever, but this would show the agreement with the provider or the hash of the agreement with the provider, and keep it in the cookie so that it would remember forever, whatever, until the cookie is removed and it's invalidated. Or it may have a rule in it that says the cookie has to be removed in 30 days.
GDPR says a cookie can only last 12 months, I think.
Right. So yeah, so but by the VRM allows the user to give their consent, for, their general consent, with standard policies that they have for different classes of websites. Otherwise, it's totally unmanageable.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So shall we come back to what needs to happen for our collective in the next couple of weeks? How many weeks, Philip? Was it?
5.
Okay, just wanted to reiterate that. All right, so 3 C's, right? So we need to have our data collection, so looking at what data we're collecting. Number 2, we need to come up with ideas and implementation of these consenting screens, wherever they pop up, where they ever need to pop up. And number 3, we need to find ways to comply on the technology side and on the process side. So can we have the right tools? Can we reach into our databases and erase that stuff if necessary? Do we need a license for that to become compliant? And then figure out roles here, right? So who's doing what when a request comes in, and who's doing the data maintenance and the recording of this stuff, putting together a manual. Documentation, essentially, right? So that's the task. I don't know how to solve it.
I think you have the good direction done beautifully well. I mean, I guess we need to keep some energy into the process of stepping forward. Nobody is going to meet the deadline. Everybody's going to be gradually approaching it, but we have to keep it in mind. And I mean, we can access the database for Mattermost. John can do magic. Do any.
Okay.
Nicely volunteered there, Jim. But just a quick point, if I may, in the response to your thread there. I think, or at least I interpreted it as you kind of conveyed, it's okay if we might just miss the deadline. It's not given our mission. We will be emailing all members before the 25th of May with everything they need to know for us to be compliant.
Yeah.
So you're leading that project, Philip?
I am. I wanted to make some more progress in March than work allowed me to, but I didn't. And so, like everyone else, the tick-tock of the clock makes you find hours you didn't know you had.
So what
yes, well, I say I lead it. I did say that I would volunteer alongside others 5 or 6 weeks ago, and now if it's good to have some more volunteers to work on it together, then that's wonderful.
I think it's
So what
a lot
help
of
do you need?
Europeans' involvement in this is pretty critical. I think at this point, don't want to lose you.
It is interesting. I think I've said this before, but it's worth just restating. Officially, when I speak about GDPR, I say it sucks. I say it sucks because it's needed. Had everybody done all this sort of stuff anyway, out of respect for their employees, out of respect for their customers and other stakeholders, then we wouldn't be in the shit we're in today. That's why it
That's
sucks.
all. Yeah.
A lack of respect.
Now, I mean, it really seems to me that who we are, we should be doing VRM. Okay, we should be doing that. The fact that VRM doesn't exist yet. Okay,
it's a little bit of a hurdle.
Can I respond to the respect point, Philip, and to say that for present and future, I totally agree. My issue is this business of unwriting the past. That always struck me as pretty damn weird. Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Clear all my data from the Mattermost records.
Right.
Wrong. I think that's unreal in any sense of social agency. Now you may take your name off it, but you put it there. It's done.
So just to clarify that the way we discussed it earlier is the simple interpretation of GDPR.
And I'm looking for a simple version of reality. That once people write things on the wall, it's difficult to take them down. So let's not try and comply with something that is utterly ridiculous.
And there is scope within the GDPR as an employer, for example, which is the better parallel for us than dealing with the public, because we are a group that's come together specifically to work on something. So we're more like employees, I think, rather than serving members of the public.
Yeah.
There is scope within the regulation to recognise the contribution of work that has, in that instance, been paid for. And the idea that you eradicate work is ridiculous because you've had a contract of employment. So in that instance, personal data, for example, if you did a technical drawing as an engineer, as an employee, and it had your initials on it, that's not personal data. If there's minutes of a meeting which attribute things from you, that's not personal data, that's work. In our instance, actually, it's kind of quasi-fuzzy in as much as we're not employees and we don't have contracts of employment. So you can't argue that it's been paid for, if you like. At the same time, deleting an item on Mattermost is fairly trivial. It might make the conversation look a little odd in hindsight, seeing somebody interacting with a ghost and not being able to hear what the other person said, kind of like over listening to someone on their phone on the train. You wouldn't hear the other person, which is a bit strange. But what we're not talking about here is deleting edits to a Google presentation, which is a corpus of work that we've worked on as a collective. That's beyond the scope of personal data.
Okay. I mean,
and you could argue that you shouldn't delete a conversational thread that was trying to reach a conclusion about a particular item. But in this instance, it's just simple enough for us to say we would just delete it and fuck it.
But I would like to, I agree with that as an expedient, but I think I would like to place a flag on that issue. Not so much in terms of the Digital Life Collective, but just as a total moral political issue. Once you say something, it's so said, baby. Don't say you didn't say it.
And do you know what? That's one of the reasons I like GDPR, because it's getting more people to ask questions like that. Whereas before they were just walking along like nothing was the matter.
Yeah.
There's been an interesting thread over on the VRM mailing list about whether GDPR applies to EU citizens or those resident in the EU. And if a European found themselves for a long weekend in the Big Apple, are they still covered? What happens if they hang out there for 2 weeks? What happens if they move for 6 months? At what point do they start getting protection? And the legal opinion on the VRM mailing list is who knows?
That's a great point, Philip, and that shows me how ridiculous that is. Because we're dealing with global citizens here, right? They can live anywhere, right? Who cares what country they're coming from, right?
I quite agree.
Totally not covered here, not thought out at all, right?
And if you can point me to a perfect regulation, then I will hold it up by example.
Yeah.
Awesome. Sorry I couldn't join from the start, Nick. You had to repeat a little bit for me, but I appreciate that you did. Thank you.
Good. So yeah, we have the recording, and you're the lead, Philip, on this project. So if you want to get something done in 5 weeks, we better get going, I would say.
I will try and bring the threads on Mattermost and on this call together into a little bit of a work, taking your 3 C's and then breaking it out by platform, and see if we can not write a document, a process collaboratively in GDocs that we can then point members to by way of compliance. And we'll also work out how we shall secure opt-in consent categorically from those members, and from those people whose information we have from the early days.
One aspect. Oops, I'm hearing echoes. Oh, it's gone now. At the start of the conversation, when you weren't here, Philip, I thought that an idea for the collective would be an umbrella, almost a contract of employment, just an umbrella opt-in agreement. When you pay your subscription and become part of the collective, there's a list of all the technology that you use and what will be recorded, etc. You either opt in or you opt out. And on the anniversary of each subscription, you opt back in again. And that will be the audit trail, I think, would be sufficient for GDPR inspection.
I agree. That's exactly as I envisage it as well, John. Great minds. The one exception being that actually they need to understand that if they pay membership but decline one of those tools, then their participation as a member would be inhibited. So we would need to make that clear. I don't think there's anything we would require them to, but apart from perhaps Stripe, otherwise they find it very difficult to contribute their membership fee.
From an admin point of view, you could trial it and just to say you have to opt into everything. And just to see if somebody actually says, well, I'd rather not be in Mattermost, then we could deal with it then. Just thinking about costs and admin. And the other thing to bear in mind is the GDPR, the guidelines and the opt-in has to be very simple language, has to be noddy language, and then it can link on then to either more detailed or the actual legal jargon. So it's no more, I don't like this being recorded, but I'll say it, when you install an Apple iPad, you need to be a solicitor and go through 68 chapters of legal jargon. I think it's good the GDPR have said, no, that's playing games. We want 3 paragraphs tops for you to make an informed decision whether you opt in or opt out.
So, and John, we should then have an 11-month term, not 12 months, so that we make sure people don't go over the 12-month deadline.
Or you could have 24 months and a renewal every 12 months. Why not? As long as you've got a record of, that's what they want, is a record of either an electronic signature, which it will be in this case, of yes, I agree, yes, you can do it. And then the option to say, I withdraw that consent, and you audit that, and that's pretty I'm simple. Trying to keep this positive. I think somebody has to be positive about GDPR. I think it's a good thing.
I love it.
Philip's correct. It's only regulation because people either, what you were saying before, Michael, about a Mattermost conversation, in this collective, it's safe. It's good. We're contributing to something that we believe in and we want to change things to make things better. But But if you're in some other kind of organization where you're chatting away and that text is being mined in order to sell you in health insurance or to decline you in health insurance, that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
So it should be removed.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we can automate GDPR for ourselves using our new tech stack.
Dun, dun, dun. Is it ready on Monday? It looks good. I saw a few bits about social ledger today. It's looking good. Or at least, let's put it this way, Joachim always does good slideware. Oh yeah. Awesome. Right,
Thanks,
have a
folks.
super weekend.
Yep.
See you online.
See you.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.